Monday, November 23rd, 1987. Holland, Michigan. A Chevy Blazer rests in a driveway, windows silvered with frost like breath held too long. The phone rings, then rings again. The silence that answers feels staged. Rick Brink, 28, steady as a workshop vise, hasn't clocked in at the Trenway plant. His boss calls the house, then his parents. Worry travels faster than traffic. The front door opens to a quiet that bites. In the bedroom, a pillow lies where comfort should be. Beneath it is Gail, 22, 3 close-range shots to the face. Outside, in the Blazer, Rick is folded toward the passenger side. 22 rounds to the left temple. The driver's window cracked as if he'd just rolled it down to greet a familiar voice. The gun is missing. The cash on the counter isn't. Jewelry sits untouched. Wedding rings still shine. No forced entry. No struggle. It looks, perversely, like a home tidied after a nightmare, staged calm, real violence. If you've ever trusted a familiar knock, you know how danger borrows a friendly voice. For the next 27 years, the house on Ransom Street will be a rumor that never fades, a question the town keeps asking itself. Files thicken, leads harden and break. Families wait through birthdays and winters, measuring time by the cases that don't move. And yet, persistence can turn silence into testimony. When detectives return with fresh eyes and the patient discipline that you know from cold case files, the tidy story begins to squeak. A window rolled down. An alibi that doesn't breathe right. A secret that was never a stranger, only a shadow. Tonight, we're not chasing monsters in alleys. We're following the footprints that relationships leave behind. If you believe justice can be late and still be right, you're in the right place. Subscribe, tap like, and stay with me, because what looked perfect was only careful, and careful always leaves edges you can peel back. Careful always leaves edges you can peel back, and to understand the edges here, you start where the story made the most sense. Holland, Michigan. In 1987, Ottawa County felt like a place that still kept faith with itself. Porch lights meant welcome, not warning. Side streets slept under maples. Neighbors waved because they knew you, not because they were checking you out. Countywide, a little over 200,000 people spread across towns stitched together by church suppers, high school football, and the rhythm of the lake. You didn't double lock the door so much as pull it to. Trouble, when it came, was supposed to wear a stranger's face. Gail Weingarten didn't grow up cushioned by money, but she was rich in velocity. She learned early how far charm can carry you when it's backed by grit. Behind a diner counter as a teenager, she could turn the breakfast rush into choreography. Orders slammed down, refills topped off, tips tucked away with a quick thank you and a quicker smile. She was the kind of person who remembered your little kid's spelling bee word and asked how it went the next week. That makes people feel seen. That builds a small army of quiet allies. Her family, big, loud, and loyal, knew she drew attention. Most of it good, some of it not. 2 older siblings, Cheryl and Ryan, played the role older siblings often do. Amateur security detail with a short fuse for anyone who didn't treat Gail right. It felt protective then, ordinary even. The idea that danger could wear a family name belonged to darker stories, to cities on the nightly news. Not Holland. If Gail moved like a spark, Rick Brink moved like a steady current. He had the kind of patience you learn from wood, measure twice, cut once, then sand the edges because good work deserves a clean finish. At the Trenway furniture plant, he was the guy you could set your watch by. Supervisors trusted him with the trickier jobs. Coworkers asked him to eyeball a level when something didn't sit right. He didn't have to be the loudest in the room. Competence tends to speak for itself. When they met, the snap was mutual and immediate. Rick came home after that first conversation and told his mother he'd met the woman he was going to marry. It sounds like a line. It wasn't. With Gail, he could be more than dependable. He could be happy and fun without apology. With Rick, Gail could be more than dazzling. She could be safe enough to dream in specifics. You can see it in the home videos friends described later. The way he looks at her right before he shows her how to hold the handle of a sledgehammer. The way she points out paint swatches like she's already living in the room that doesn't exist yet. They married on April 25th, 1986, the day after her 21st birthday, in a ceremony that fit the place. Church vows, family laughter, lake light on the reception photos. And then they did what a lot of young couples in the Midwest do when the future knocks. They bought a problem and turned it into a plan. Rick's father found a foreclosed house on Ransom Street just outside town, 20 acres of not yet, with a weathered structure in the middle. The roof wanted attention. The walls wanted forgiveness. Rick saw promise. Gail saw rooms with purpose. They moved in that October. Weekends took on the shape of progress. Cabinets off, cabinets on, a scrape on Rick's knuckles, a smear of primer on Gail's cheek, a list on the fridge that never got shorter, only more specific. They didn't keep a renovation vlog. This was the 80s, but they kept evidence anyway. Camcorder clips, scribbled measurements on masking tape, receipts pinned with a magnet shaped like a tulip. If you lay those artifacts on a table now, you can watch a marriage build itself in real time. The house didn't just shelter them, it absorbed them, each repair a small declaration about the life they meant to have. If you've ever poured weekends into a house, you know how the future lives in half-finished rooms. It's in the stud you, sister a little stronger because you're thinking ahead to a crib along that wall. It's in the extra outlet you add because one day a lamp will go here, beside a rocking chair. Gail had started saying nursery out loud to Cheryl. Not someday, soon. The word felt like an anchor finally touching the bottom. They were social, too, in the way couples are when the grind is sweet instead of heavy. Friends remember the boat on Lake Michigan that summer, the way Gail learned to water ski, the laughter when she got it right and the louder laughter when she didn't. Ordinary happiness is easy to miss until it's gone. Then it glows in retrospect, like a sign you wish you'd photographed. The last weekend played like so many do in late fall. A wedding for a high school friend of Rick's, a chance to dress up, to dance, to remember that renovation dust washes off. They didn't close the bar. They weren't that couple. They left around 11, the car turning onto familiar roads under a sky that had cleared to cold. Holland's lights thinned out in the rear view. The dark thickened around Ransom Street in the way country dark does, deep but uncomplicated, the kind you grow up trusting. And then the quiet that followed didn't behave like quiet. It stretched too long. Monday started without Rick at his workstation, and in a county like this, that's a louder alarm than a siren. The house that had learned their names no longer answered when you called them. The details the detectives would soon catalog. The driver's window cracked as if at a neighbor's knock. The pillow placed like an obscenity of mercy. The valuables sitting there like props that didn't know their cues. Those belonged to the investigation. What belongs here, to the life before the file number, is simpler and heavier. Two people who had just started to turn a place into a future, a community that still believed it could tell the difference between inside and outside, and a family that didn't yet know how long waiting can last. Holland prized stories with clean lines. Hard work, decent neighbors, a lake that gives you summer and takes your complaints in winter. Gail and Rick were that story in motion, ambition matched with steadiness, sparkle set into a frame. That's what was stolen. Not just breath and heartbeat, but the ordinary tomorrows they were building with primer and patience. The tragedy lands differently when you've walked through their rooms. You stop thinking about headlines and start thinking about a half-hung door that would never swing true unless someone like Rick finished it. About a paint card tucked in a drawer with a color circled for a room that would not be named. And you understand why? For years, the case would sit like a dare to anybody who believes in persistence, the kind of dare Cold Case Files is built to accept. And then the investigation begins, not with a revelation, but with a list. Patrol secures the house on Ransom Street, tape goes up, and the first detective steps into a quiet that feels engineered. The odor of fresh paint rides above older wood and colder air. Clipboard, camera, sequence, exterior, vehicle, threshold, hall, bedroom. You can almost hear the checklist whispering, observe before you touch, photograph before you move, think before you decide. Outside first. The Chevy Blazer sits where hope first flickered and then died. The driver's window is partly down, enough for a conversation at arm's length, the kind where you lean in because you recognize the voice. Inside the cab, Rick is folded toward the passenger side, knees bent against the floorboard, upper body canted as if gravity took over exactly when the moment turned. The wounds sit on the left side of his head, two, close range, the kind of pattern you see when the shooter is near and the shot is certain. There's a hole through the passenger side glass, a neat geometry that says a bullet went where the conversation ended. Rick's hands aren't in a defensive mess. There's no explosive chaos of broken interior. It reads like trust interrupted. The path from driveway to front door isn't a struggle. Leaves are ordinary. The threshold is ordinary. The lock is ordinary. No splinter, no pry. Inside, the temperature is a little warmer than the air that's just flowed in with uniforms and boots and procedure. The house is mid-renovation, so undisturbed is relative, but even in fresh construction dust, there's a rhythm to lived-in space. What's on the counter? What's left on a chair? What's pushed aside to make room for tomorrow's work? On the kitchen counter, cash sits visible, careless in the way cash only sits when it belongs to a normal day. And wallets are present. Gail's jewelry isn't missing. The gleam of routine still clings to it. Wedding rings remain where vows put them. Down the hall, the bedroom is a study in contradictions. A pillow lies over Gail's face, a grotesque imitation of care, placed by someone who knew what a pillow is supposed to do and elected to make it mean the opposite. When it's lifted, the pattern is unforgiving. 3 point-blank wounds to the face, contact or near contact range, the kind of decision that stops identity and sends a message at the same time. There are clothes on the floor in a small, undramatic pile, like the mundane gesture that happens before sleep. There are no overturned drawers, no lamplit tableau of sudden rage where the furniture remembers being thrown. It's quieter than it should be, the way a set looks when the stagehands have already swept. The theory people reach for first, in houses where 2 bodies are found and love used to live, is the darkest domestic version. Murder-suicide. It's ugly, but it's common, and common explanations have gravity. The detectives test it, because duty requires testing what you wish isn't true. But the test fails early and thoroughly. There's no weapon. The .22 caliber handgun that would make sense of a spouse killing a spouse, and then himself is missing. And missing changes everything. A murder-suicide is an ending that doesn't walk away. Here, the ending left. It crossed the threshold. It took the gun. It carried its noise out into the cold, and it left the scene to pretend nothing had happened. Shell casings? None? That could mean a revolver, no ejected brass to find. It could also mean meticulous pickup. A shooter who knows what transfers, what drops, what sings to a lab later. Either way, the silence multiplies. Latent prints are scarce, Surfaces are either not helpful or have already been wiped by normal living. Still, technicians find a few, 6 in all. 4 belong to the couple, as you'd expect in a home. The other 2, one from a phone, one from a bathroom fixture, don't match anyone on file in 1987. That doesn't crown a suspect. It just adds a new question to the cabinet. Who touches a phone and a toilet but leaves almost nothing else to say they were here? There's no forced entry on a door or jam that would tell a simpler story. Stranger, break, violence. The house refuses to say intruder with the blunt clarity of a kicked-in lock. Everything whispers familiar. The driver's window is an invitation that was answered. The pillow is a terrible intimacy. The untouched valuables dare you to admit this wasn't about money. It's about access, about entitlement, about a person confident enough to leave a room arranged as if death could be tidied. Time of death estimates will land in the early hours of Sunday, after the wedding, inside that window when most neighbors are asleep and dogs bark at nothing in particular. The phone records show calls that aren't answered. A brother tries and gets the long ring that becomes part of family lore. The scene teams work their grid, swabbing, dusting, photographing. They know what they don't have. Footprints that speak, hairs that survive the vacuum, fibers that leap from one life to another in a way a microscope can certify. They also know the performance of emptiness is itself a kind of presence. Outside the tape, Holland recalibrates. You can measure fear in little habits. The way a hand now tests a deadbolt twice, the way porch lights stay on longer, the attempt to memorize the sound of the neighbor's truck because suddenly you want to know what belongs. At the flower shop on River Avenue, someone says nobody sleeps the same. Parents hold curfews in their fists a little tighter. You hear the phrase, "Things like this don't happen here," mutate into a question without a mark at the end. Inside the briefing room, detectives write on the board what the house refuses to say out loud. They erase murder-suicide. They circle no forced entry. They underline window partly down. 22, pillow, cash jewelry undisturbed, and 2 unknown prints. They draw 2 timelines. The last known movements of Gail and Rick, and the earliest credible moment a third person could have intersected those lines without breaking anything obvious. It isn't much to hang a case on. It's more than nothing. A wiped scene isn't empty. Cold case files treat silence as data. Here, silence says the killer was comfortable. Silence says the killer believed cleanup was a synonym for clever. Silence says the killer expected time to finish the job that bullets started. And for a long time, months, then years, that expectation will look correct. The county will stack boxes, the families will stack seasons, and the house will learn to be a landmark people pass without turning their heads. But even in 1987, even on day one, the scene has already told the truth in small, stubborn ways. Who gets a window rolled down? Who knows where the bedroom is? Who thinks a pillow can erase a face? All of that is the opposite of random. All of that is the opposite of stranger. And all of that will matter when the file comes back to life. All of that will matter when the file comes back to life. But first, the investigation has to trip over every story that looks good before it turns out to be wrong. The first good story is the oldest one in the drawer. The volatile X. People remember the black eye, the slam drawer, the breakup that felt like a fuse burning back toward the powder. Detectives bring him in early. He doesn't lawyer up. He talks. He submits to a polygraph, the kind of imperfect tool that still has value when a man who loves to posture suddenly has to sit still and keep his pulse company. The chart says he's not lying about the only questions that matter. His alibi checks. His timeline holds. Whatever else he is, the numbers and the hours say he isn't here. Not on this night, not at this house. He's cleared. Next comes a story you can't help chasing because it's cinematic. The wrong house theory. The previous owner had a messy reputation and messy friends, biker ties, bad business. The sort of orbit where violence and cash shake hands a lot. It isn't hard to draw the line. Enemies show up to settle a score, don't realize the house has changed hands, and leave two innocents dead. The house on Ransom Street becomes a tragic address on a map of someone else's war. Detectives follow that map. They talk to informants who speak in half phrases and favors. They chase the rumor from Holland to grittier blocks downstate and back again. It feels like progress because the story has gravity. It reassures you that evil would knock on the wrong door, not the familiar one. But rumor is not evidence. Phones are checked. Vehicles are accounted for. Associates with something to gain by pointing elsewhere suddenly have nothing to say. Leads fray. The line to the wrong house snaps, and the frame that made a kind of narrative sense collapses under the weight of zero facts. Then, in December, fear gets a local address. Another homicide, close by, similar age, same broad circle of small-town overlap, lights up the boards. It's holiday season, the time of year when familiarity is turned up, and the shock is amplified by that contrast. You can feel how quickly the human brain wants the shortcut. A serial predator, a single shadow you can point at, so the terror becomes coherent. The sheriff's office pulls old files. They revisit a 1970s case with echoes. Patrols adjust. Parents start explaining curfews instead of just announcing them. And the lab work starts to rule instead of imagine. And signatures don't match. The means, the timing, the artifacts that killers leave without meaning to, none of it lines up in a way that earns the word linked. Geography is suggestive. It is not probative. The cases that look like they ought to be siblings turn out to be only neighbors. You've heard it, it must all be connected. Most of the time, it isn't. That lesson is hard on communities and harder on detectives, because connected is comforting even when it's terrifying. One monster is a cleaner story than three unrelated bad men. But the board in the squad room isn't a novel outline. It's a ledger. You can't buy a theory with vibes. You have to purchase it with verifiable minutes, with tire impressions, with calls that ping off the right tower at the right time, with a witness who didn't just hear something but saw it and can still stand by it when a defense attorney is trying to make them doubt their own eyes. In the Brink case, the board keeps rejecting the glamorous answer. The violent X. Not there when it counts. The biker vendetta. Smoke without fire. The December homicide. Close in space, far in pattern. Each time a seductive narrative fails, what remains grows louder by subtraction. No forced entry, valuables untouched, a driver's window rolled partway down, as if at a friendly knock. Outside the tape line, you can watch fear reorganize daily life. Hardware stores sell more deadbolts than wreaths. Porch lights stay on until dawn, then stay on anyway. Car windows stop rolling down at late-night taps. Teens who used to pedal past Ransom Street now pick longer routes. The radio shifts from Christmas standards to news breaks, and people who never said case start saying it like they own a piece of it because they do. That's what proximity fear looks like. Not hysteria, just 1,000 tiny edits to habit. Inside the investigation, proximity fear can lead you the wrong way. 2. Draw a compass around the crime scene, and everything inside the circle feels meaningful. But the circle lies if you let it. The job is to let evidence, not radius, decide who gets a line drawn to their name. That is where cold case thinking, the cold case file's temperament, earns its keep. Treat silence as data, treat coincidence as suspect, and let the little stubborn facts bully the pretty stories out of the room. By the end of this phase, the detectives have learned what the case is not. It is not a stranger smashing a door. It is not a biker feud taking a wrong exit. It is not the opening stanza of a serial ballad. With each discarded path, the scene's earliest whispers sound more like statements. Whoever did this knew the house, knew the voice in the blazer, knew how to place a pillow like a performance. Which means the next question isn't about a map. It's about a family tree. The most dangerous suspect is the one you're taught to love. Which means the next question isn't about a map. It's about a family tree. Start with the frictions that don't make headlines because they live in phone calls and favors, money owed, promises stretched, boundaries tested. In the weeks before the murders, Gail had co-signed on a car for her brother Ryan. Payments lagged. Excuses arrived on time. Around the same stretch, a new wrinkle. Their parents' RV needed a place to sit a while. 20 acres on Ransom Street looked like a convenient solution if you didn't own the liability, the insurance, or the unfinished spaces where younger siblings still drifted in and out. Gail said no. Not cruelly. Practically. Renovation zones and family encampments make bad roommates. But no in a family isn't just a syllable. It can sound like judgment. To someone already carrying resentment, it can sound like, you think you're better than us. 8. Neighbors remember that Ryan's orbit around the couple tightened and then twitched. He could be solicitous, even helpful, then sharp if a line got drawn. That push-pull matters because the scene at Ransom Street doesn't read as a stranger taking chances. It reads as someone who felt entitled to stand close. Entitlement and grievance are cousins. They visit together. When investigators work outward from the house, Ryan is in the first ring of names you must interview, not because of a smoking gun, but because access is everything. He and his girlfriend Pam sit for questions in 1987. They come equipped with an all-night alibi so tidy you could box it. A laundromat run, a detour to finish washing at a friend's place, then home till daylight. Nothing impossible in it. Nothing sloppy. That's the problem. Real memory leaks. It tangles around timestamps and the off-by-20-minute stuff that proves you aren't performing. Theirs doesn't. It behaves like something best rehearsed in the car on the way over. Still, in that first round, there isn't a clean way to puncture the timeline. Detectives can't arrest a hunch, and tidy isn't a crime. They note it, bracket it, and move on. But the pen doesn't stay capped. Because grief has a sound, and what people say at funerals either harmonizes with that sound or it doesn't. Several relatives recall moments that struck them wrong, not as definitive proof of anything, just as notes you can't unhear. A too vivid description of the hallway, as if the speaker had walked it with a flashlight no one else carried. A comment floating the unthinkable, sometimes I wonder if I could have done this, and then walking it back into fog. The sort of line that could be read as a man unspooling under shock, or as a man testing how his words land. After the service, life should retreat to casseroles and logistics. Ryan's choices don't always do that. There's talk of selling the waterbed where Gail had slept, fast, cheap, like the quickest way to excise a memory is to monetize it. There's the rummaging through a dead sister's mail, the heat turned up around any remnant that suggests she had a life separate from anyone else's control. Individually, each detail can be explained away by temperament, by stress, by the way some people try to tidy catastrophe into tasks. Collectively, they nudge the room's temperature lower. Investigators also collect the small social weather reports, the kinds of observations that never make it into official summaries but live forever in notebooks. How Ryan reacts when someone questions him. How often he references the couple's newly improved life on Ransom Street with a bitterness that sounds like an invoice no one agreed to pay. How he repeats the laundry timeline like a script rather than a memory. Chronology first, feeling later, as though the order of events stood sentry between him and any follow-up question that strays off the paved path. None of this overclaims. None of it convicts. But cases like this rarely move on the dramatic flourish. They move on the places where a personality rubs against a fact until the varnish comes off. It is not unusual for a family to argue about money. It is not unusual for siblings to snipe over who gets to say no. It is, however, notable when a homicide scene screams familiar access, and the person whose access was most contested arrives with an alibi that sounds frictionless in a week defined by friction. If you've ever listened to two people tell the same story about a shared night, you know how the true ones drift apart in small, honest ways. We got there at 9. No, maybe 8:45. Remember the song? The neat ones tend to squeak. The Brink file picks up that squeak around Ryan. Detectives don't crown him. They don't need to. They place him at the edge of the frame and keep their pencil nearby. There's another reason he stays in view. The house itself is arguing for someone who knew where things were. No forced entry. No rummaging. A driver's window rolled down as if at a known knock. A pillow placed not by panic, but by a person comfortable enough to move objects around a room. Who fits that profile better than the brother who believed the land should host an RV because family should trump liability? Who would expect his presence to be accepted in a late-night conversation without setting off alarms? Again, plausible focus, not proclamation. The board in the squad room doesn't replace evidence with inference. It just draws arrows worth following. And the arrows all begin to point in the same practical direction. Test the alibi, test the temperament, and test the edges where resentment meets opportunity. Because whatever else this case is, the scene insists on an actor who arrived pre-invited by history. The neatest stories squeak. Real memory is messier. Real memory is messier, and that's where psychology starts to earn its keep. When homicide lives inside a family system, the story the offender tells isn't a confession, it's a cover. One of the oldest covers is the pseudo-consent myth. The claim that what happened was mutual, just curiosity, kids exploring, or nobody got hurt. Clinicians have seen this pattern across decades of casework. It's not language meant to persuade an expert, it's language meant to let the speaker keep living with himself. The phrases are euphemisms that sand down violence into something domesticated. In reality, power runs only one way, older to younger, stronger to vulnerable, entitled to unentitled. Control doesn't require chains when it can borrow the vocabulary of innocence. That same mental furniture shows up later, when the victim grows up and builds a life that no longer runs through the offender. Boundaries are a threat to entitlement. The psychology is painfully simple. If a person has long framed a relative as an extension of himself, attention he can summon, time he can consume, decisions he can bend, then a spouse, a deed, and a set of house keys become provocations. A wedding ring says, "This person chooses differently now." A mortgage says, "This land answers to us." A no about an RV isn't about parking, it's about sovereignty. To a healthy sibling, that's an ordinary adult conversation. To someone organized around control, it's humiliation. And humiliation is a catalyst. Entitlement tries two tactics when it hits a wall. The first is negotiation disguised as nostalgia. Come on, it's family. Remember when? The second is coercion dressed as inevitability. You owe me. You think you're better. I'll make you regret this. The leap from sulk to threat isn't always audible from the outside because family systems are expert at muffling sound. People who grow up together develop rules, what gets said, what gets swallowed, what gets rewritten after the fact. Outsiders hear a joke. Insiders hear the warning inside the joke. So, why do families miss the signs? Start with loyalty. In most households, loyalty is the glue that holds chaos together. It tells siblings to forgive quickly, tell funny versions of ugly nights, and protect the family name when gossip starts to circle. Then add denial. Denial is not stupidity, it's self-defense. To say this person I love is dangerous is to declare bankruptcy on years of birthdays, barbecues, and good memories. Many people would rather refinance the truth than do that. Finally, layer in the nice town filter. In places like Holland, safety isn't just a condition, it's a civic identity. Neighbors believe in the difference between inside and outside, us and them. When something violent happens, it feels better, safer, to chase the biker rumor or the serial killer headline than to admit the risk might have a last name you share. This isn't armchair theory, it has behavioral tells. Offenders who rely on secrecy also rely on rehearsal. Listen for stories that are too straight, timelines that don't breathe, apologies that arrive with invoices attached. Watch for boundary testing around property, money, and access, who assumes entry, who resents being asked to call first. Pay attention to what gets curated at funerals, who speaks, what details they emphasize, how they perform grief. People can cry and still control the narrative. They can eulogize and still edit. There's also the offender's self-myth. In courtrooms and kitchens, it tends to swing between grandiosity and self-pity. Grandiosity says, "I'm the only one who understands what really happened." Self-pity says, "Everyone is against me. I'm being framed by lies." Both serve the same function, to keep the spotlight off the facts and on the offender's feelings. It's why you often see outbursts when a victim or witness finally speaks in a way that can't be controlled. Rage is the last tool of a collapsing story. If you've ever heard someone say, "They'd never do that. I've known them my whole life," you've met the problem. Longevity of acquaintance isn't evidence of character. It's just time elapsing. Good investigations learn to translate family noise into admissible signal. That translation requires patience, not just fingerprints. It means re-interviewing people after loyalties shift, after fear softens, after someone is finally tired of carrying a secret that wasn't theirs to carry. Patterns hide in plain sight. Cold case files looks for repeated excuses. The repeated excuse in family-centered crimes is almost always a softer word, standing in for a harder reality. Exploring for coercion, helping for control, family for ownership. When detectives stop taking the euphemisms at face value, the case stops orbiting rumors and starts tracing gravity. The pull of entitlement toward any boundary it can't tolerate. In the Brink timeline, those dynamics don't prove a perpetrator by themselves, but they redraw the map of plausibility. The crime scene whispers familiarity. The disputes sketch entitlement. The tidy alibi speaks rehearsal. And the off notes around the funeral sound like a narrator who needs the story more than the truth. Psychology doesn't replace evidence. It tells you where to look harder, whom to ask again, and which words to translate before you write them down. From here, the file doesn't need a new rumor. It needs a new angle on an old voice, the one that kept the neatest story alive. From here, the file doesn't need a new rumor. It needs a new angle on an old voice, the one that kept the neatest story alive. That angle arrives with time. In 2009, Ottawa County formalizes what grief and persistence have been asking for. A cold case unit. New desks, old boxes, fresh eyes, stale coffee. The mandate is simple and punishing. Start over. Don't inherit anybody's hunches. Touch every page. They pull the Brink binders from the shelf and pop the rings. Photos first, because images center the mind, then reports, lab slips, typed interviews, handwritten margins that feel like whispers from another decade. They reconstruct the original investigative clock, when patrol arrived, in what order rooms were processed, who was interviewed before fatigue began to bend judgment. They list the early theories, not to relive them, but to audit them. Biker feud. They follow the old paths far enough to confirm the emptiness. Violent X. Recheck the alibi and polygraph. Confirm the clearance. December homicide in the 70s echo. Still proximity, not pattern. Then they start where the scene itself always pointed, familiar access, and they scroll down the list of relatives and intimates. When they reach the 1987 interviews with Ryan and his then-girlfriend Pam, they slow down. Tidy timelines age poorly. Memory is organic, scripts are not. A small notation in an old polygraph summary flickers. One answer from Pam that did not agree with the together all night story. The discrepancy is narrow, but unforgiving. She indicated they were not together the whole night. In 1987, that hairline crack didn't have much to travel through. In 2009 and beyond, with loyalty shifted by decades and fear eroded by exhaustion, a hairline can become a fault. They do not sprint. They build. The unit re-interviews friends who were background characters the first time around. One of Ryan's former girlfriends, still in the county, still frank, describes a post-murder drive that ended at a park where confessions came out sideways. A fixation on Gail, a history that sounded like a boast hiding inside a sin, and a way of talking about the body at the house that felt more like memory than rumor. The detectives write it down, not because one account decides a case, but because it harmonizes with the crime scene's oldest melody. Closeness misused. They go back to family. Grief has cooled from flame to coal. It gives off a steadier heat. Relatives recall things that didn't land right in 1987. A description of the hallway so specific it felt like a map. A sentence tossed like a dare. Sometimes I wonder if I could have done this, and then yanked back with a laugh that no one shared. They remember a rush to sell the waterbed, the rummaging through a dead sister's mail, the way resentment spoke fluently about the Ransom Street land and the RV that never parked there. Each recollection by itself is atmospheric. Together, they start to contour a person who needed control more than he needed comfort. The cold case team is careful about story versus signal. They do what the first team did well: verify movements, confirm calls, test alibis, but with a few advantages no one had in 1987. Time has rearranged loyalties. Children have grown. People who kept a secret out of fear now keep a secret out of habit, and habits can crack when someone sits across a table and says, "We are not going away." The detectives invite Pam back in. They don't let anyone sit with her. The questions are quiet and specific. The aim is not to corner, but to unspool. The first sessions don't explode, they fray. Pam's phrasing shifts from declarative to qualified. I think, I'm not sure. Maybe we got home earlier. The neat box she carried for years creaks at the edges. She concedes what the polygraph hinted, that all night wasn't all night. He left. He returned. He left again. The chronology that once posed as certainty now functions like a wall with fresh daylight bleeding through a seam. If you've ever held a story too tightly, you know it breaks where you press the hardest. The detectives log that break and widen it with corroboration. Phone logs don't sing an aria, but they hum along with the new account. A friend confirms that laundry happened earlier than claimed. The "we were always together" refrain loses its chorus. Meanwhile, the former girlfriend's park story lines up with other off notes the family remembered, too vivid scene talk, domination disguised as caretaking, control sewn into ordinary acts. Inside the unit, there's a discipline about language. No one says, "got him." They say, "narrowed." They don't say proof. They say, "wait." Because in a case built on stage silence, weight is what matters. How many separate facts point in the same direction without touching each other first? The direction is toward entitlement, meeting a boundary and answering it with violence, toward a familiar voice at a half-lowered truck window, toward a person who could place a pillow without triggering alarm, because the bedroom wasn't foreign to him as a concept. They keep going. Re-interviews expand the life around the alibi. How did he react when the first detectives called? Who did he try to manage? What letters did he write? Who did he warn? These aren't gossip prompts. They're control metrics. Controllers repeat themselves. They script other people. They check back after interviews to sand down rough admissions. When that pattern emerges, the unit marks it as behavior consistent with someone who needs a story more than he needs the truth. At this stage, technology isn't the hero. Lab retesting has limits when a scene was sterile from the start. What moves the needle is people, memories relieved of old pressures and placed side by side until their overlaps can't be dismissed as coincidence. It's why cold case units so often function like truth's patient librarians. Pulling the same book twice because the first time you were too angry, the second time you were too scared, and the third time you're just tired enough to be honest. Not a lab miracle, patience, persistence, and second looks. That's the cold case method in a sentence. The miracle, if you want to call it that, is human. Someone deciding to stop carrying a lie that was never theirs. In Holland, that decision gathers momentum across 2011 and 2012, until the always together alibi sits alone at the table and no longer looks like company. By 2013, the file that once felt like a closed piano starts to play again. The notes are small, an old polygraph line, a former girlfriend's park confession, relatives' memories that finally say out loud what their stomachs knew, but they resolve into a chord. The neatest story squeaks. Real memory, at last, is allowed to be messy. And when mess is permitted, truth can breathe. The unit turns toward the person who's been at the edge of the frame since the beginning and prepares to ask the oldest question in a new way. If you weren't there, why does your alibi sound like practice? And if you were, why does the scene sound like you? By 2013, the questions have stopped bouncing off old walls and started finding seams. That's when Pam walks in alone. No one sits beside her. No one rehearses the answers in the parking lot. The room is plain, the kind meant to be forgettable. Detectives set a recorder on the table and ask for the story from the beginning, not the story that has been carried like a crate, but the one that has been carried like a bruise. She starts with the part that seems small until it isn't. They were home by around 8 p.m. Laundry wasn't an all-night odyssey. It was a chore that ended before the night did. He left. He came back. He left again. The words don't arrive like fireworks. They arrive like weather, steadily, undeniably, changing the light on everything you thought you saw. The timeline that once posed as certainty thins to what it always was. A cover draped over a hole. Pam keeps going. Morning. A pounding at her door that wasn't a knock so much as a command. When she opened it, he was crying. The cry wasn't grief, it was adrenaline burning down. "I killed Gail and Rick," he told her, words like a key dropped into a drain. Shock doesn't throw you backward, it freezes you exactly where you are. She couldn't make her mouth shape a response because the response had to acknowledge a reality she couldn't afford yet. He filled the silence by giving it orders. He drove. Not to his place, not to a church, not to any of the locations where remorse pretends to live. Back to Ransom Street. The choice wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. Control works best when it is rehearsed in the same room as the fear. He took her by the wrist and made her look. The blazer. The bedroom. The pillow. He asked her, like a schoolyard dare wrapped in nightmare, "Isn't she beautiful?" The question wasn't a question. It was a demonstration. I decide what you see and how you remember seeing it. Then came the sentence that closed the lid on her life for decades. If you tell anyone, I'll do this to you. If you've ever kept a secret to stay alive, you understand why silence isn't consent, it's survival. From there, the mechanics of control look banal because that's how they always look. He took her back to his place. A friend dropped by for coffee. He casually narrated the murders like an anecdote from a bad night on television, all while the bodies hadn't yet been discovered, long before the official calls went out and the official shock could be performed. Pam understood that ordinary acts, pouring coffee, swapping jokes, were the staging for extraordinary terror. You can't run screaming if the script insists it's a Tuesday. Later, at his car, he showed her the weapon and a bag of clothes he planned to dispose of. He wasn't asking for help. He was onboarding her into the risk so that her fear would have a flange he could grab. On the ride home, the rehearsal began. The laundromat story. The trip to a friend's place. The night that ended only at dawn. The phrases were as precise as cut lumber. The beats came in a fixed order. He would repeat them so many times over so many years that they stopped sounding like a lie and started sounding like a lullaby sung under threat. Control wasn't limited to an alibi. It became a way of living. He called often, a choke chain of check-ins that made privacy a punishable offense. He isolated her from friends who might ask questions he couldn't supervise. He framed defiance as betrayal, confusion as disloyalty, fear as evidence she didn't love him enough. When she wavered, he pivoted from rage to pity to charm and back again in one conversation, because whiplash keeps you busy managing your own balance instead of managing your safety. If she ever strayed toward telling the truth, he'd unspool old stories about unfair cops, about how families turn on you, about how the world would take her children if she said the wrong sentence to the wrong person. And yet, the human capacity to endure has a twin. The human capacity to stop. In the interview room, decades after the threat, Pam chooses the twin. She says the quiet parts out loud. She clarifies the timeline. She quotes the confession in a voice that sounds like it has carried a weight across an ocean. She describes the coerced tour, the inventory of fear, the threat that has lived in her muscles ever since. As she speaks, her phone, kept off, vibrates on the table like a trapped moth. Calls, texts, more calls. The detectives have seen this before. An abuser trying to keep a story from slipping its leash. 30 messages can feel like 3, those are 0. When every ping is a warning that the old rules are still in effect. But for once, the room enforces new rules. The door is closed. He isn't here. She can finish a sentence without interruption. This is where the cold case team's philosophy matters more than any machine. They don't poke holes in trauma to make it bleed on command. They anchor it. Who else knew? What time did the pounding start? Where were the cables for the blazer kept? Did he use the word jump or the word help? They aren't trivia questions. They're rails that let the truthful train keep moving. When she finishes, one of the detectives asks the question that marks the pivot from investigation to protection. Do you feel safe going home tonight? It's not a courtesy. It's the signal that the room has turned from what happened to what has to happen next. The decision point is simple because it has to be. The unit cannot send Pam back into a house where the leash is digital, habitual, and potentially lethal. They also cannot risk an afternoon where a man who's kept control this long gets an extra hour to destroy evidence, to rehearse a new speech, to recruit loyalists, to run. Questions yield to cuffs. They move before momentum can spoil. When the arrest team locates him, the choreography is crisp. He denies. He pivots to anger. He test drives pity. He invokes the old script about police pressure, about a wife who doesn't understand, about conspiracies with names he thinks sound official. None of it changes the math in the room. The neat alibi is broken. The confession exists and is corroborated by details no rumor could provide. The tour and the threat are consistent with a pattern detectives know too well. Violence plus ownership plus fear. This is where cold case files outlasts fear. Not because technology suddenly rescued an empty scene, but because human patience gave courage somewhere to land. Pam's long night becomes a long morning that, finally, belongs to her. And to the memory of Gail and Rick, whose house on Ransom Street no longer has to carry the silence alone. Questions yield to cuffs, and with cuffs come denials. At the station, he sits in the harsh light and tries on tones like suits. First, bafflement. He doesn't understand why he's here. This is all a mistake. Then, indignation. How dare they disturb his life? Then, condescension. They're young. They don't know real police work. They're being played by a bitter wife. When detectives confront him with the broken alibi, he shrugs it off. She must be confused. She must be emotional. She must be lying. When they bring up the morning admission, he retreats to a narrower claim. Maybe he said something that was taken wrong. When they ask about the bedroom, the pillow, the blazer's half-lowered window, he insists he's only repeating rumors. Everyone in town was talking. The self-serving narratives contradict each other, but contradiction doesn't slow him. It's the point. Keep the air moving and hope the smoke is mistaken for fog. A judge signs the paperwork, and the county that learned to sleep with its deadbolts checks the headlines twice. The charge is double murder. The timeline is 1987 to now. The narrative is control. He's moved to a cell where the only schedule is someone else's. Even there, he tries to manage the story, letters that beg and threaten, calls that ping anyone who might still take them, new theories that blame a dozen different shadows. None of the shadows cast a measurable silhouette. Trial doesn't arrive quickly because trial shouldn't. The prosecution builds not a spectacle, but a staircase, each step a fact that holds weight. Their theory of motive isn't exotic. It's human and ugly. Jealousy of a sister's new stability. Rage at boundaries that said no and meant it. Fear that exposure of a long, shameful history would end the image he maintained and the control he required. The scene on Ransom Street fits that theory without being forced. The friendly roll of a truck window, the pillow placed like a counterfeit kindness, valuables ignored because money wasn't the point. When court opens, the room is full for reasons that don't show up on a docket. Families who have borne patience like a yoke, neighbors who still drive past Ransom Street slower than necessary, reporters who remember the first time they typed the names Gail and Rick and the last time they dared hope for resolution. Voir dire selects 12 people and alternates who promise to do a strange thing in a human story, feeling while keeping feelings from steering. The state calls witnesses in an order that mirrors the case they've built. Detectives describe the original scene without gore or gloss. What was there? What was not? What the absence meant. A former girlfriend recounts a park conversation where the defendant's fixation on Gail sounded like bragging wrapped in confession. Family members testify about remarks that never fit grief. A hallway described as if seen in the dark, an offer to sell a waterbed days after the funeral, a rummaging through private mail that looked like posthumous possession. And then Pam takes the stand. Before she speaks, the courtroom feels like a held breath. She doesn't dramatize, she narrates. Home by roughly 8 p.m. He left. He returned. He left till morning. The pounding on her door. The admission. I killed Gail and Rick. The coerced drive. The blazer. The pillow. The question that wasn't a question. The threat that lasted a quarter century. She tells the jury how the laundromat story was installed in her life like unwanted furniture, moved with her wherever she went. She tells them how control feels when it replaces weather. Omnipresent, taken for granted, suffocating without visible hands. The defense objects where they can, and the judge rules where she must, but the shape of what Pam says is unaltered by procedure. It is specific where rumor is vague. It is consistent where invention stumbles. It is ordinary in its details, which is another way of saying believable. Across the room, the defendant's patience frays. He interrupts under his breath, then above it. He shakes his head at the jurors as if they are students who've missed an obvious lesson. When Pam repeats the threat in the present tense, as trauma often forces the grammar, his face floods with a heat he can't regulate. Deputies tighten their posture. The judge's tone drops into the register trial, judges reserved for toddlers and tyrants. You will wait your turn. The jury sees something no expert needs to explain. The same volatility that once lived in private, now failing to disguise itself in public. The defense answers with alternatives. Unknown intruder. Biker feud that spilled into the wrong house. Resurrected from the rumor mill with no new flesh on the bones. A whisper about a financial document at Gail's work that somehow drew a killer to a bedroom. Speculation wearing a tie. They hire an expert willing to suggest that a window hole might be crowbar, not bullet, as if semantics could erase the autopsy. But alternatives must fit the facts to matter. No forced entry remains stubborn. Cash on the counter remains indifferent. Wedding rings on remain radiant in their indifference to theft. The blazer's half-lowered window remains conversational. The pillow remains obscene. The two unidentified prints from 1987 remain unexplained but inert. No match to the defendant, no match to any known intruder either. Artifacts of daily life, not a phantom signature. Most tellingly, the supposed strangers who would have risked a double murder leave behind none of the noise strangers usually do. Cross-examination tries to make Pam doubt her own sentences. She doesn't. She concedes the limits of memory where they exist and insists on the anchors that never moved. The jury watches a person who isn't trying to win. She's trying to finish. There's a difference, and jurors, citizens drafted into clarity, can feel it. The prosecution closes without fireworks. They stack what the defendant knocked over. Yay! They remind the jurors of the scene's first truths. A window rolled down for someone trusted. Valuables ignored. No forced entry. A bedroom altered by a person comfortable enough to move objects within it. They tie those truths to conduct before and after. Resentment about money and land. Too vivid talk about the hallway. The waterbed for sale. The rumor-mongering that always located guilt somewhere else. The letters from jail that begged and bullied in equal measure. They do not ask the jury to like Pam or anyone else. They ask them to hear her. They ask them to weigh consistency and corroboration against bluster and performance. The defense closes with appeals to doubt and the specter of coincidence. Isn't it possible, they ask, that all of this is simply the human tendency to connect dots that don't belong together? But possibility isn't the standard. Reason is, the law does not require certainty beyond all doubt, only beyond reasonable doubt. Doubt with a backbone, not a wish. The judge instructs accordingly. Deliberations don't take days. They take the time due to 2 lives and the evidence that speaks for them. Jurors request a readback of Pam's timeline and the detective's testimony about the missing gun and the door with no story of force to tell. When they file back in, the gallery stands without being asked. Guilty, the foreperson says, on both counts of murder. 8. Sound returns to the room in layers. Air leaving lungs, a quiet sob, a rustle of tissue, the shuffle of deputies repositioning to hold the moment within the rails. The defendant's face does what performances do when the script runs out, collapses into louder versions of itself. The judge sets sentencing and reminds everyone that outbursts are not arguments. They're evidence of something else, and not the kind that helps. At sentencing, family members speak in tones that have been practiced for years because grief forced them to rehearse. Rick's brother talks about holidays that never properly started again, about the way a name can empty a room and fill it at the same time. Gail's sister talks about rooms that became museums to before. The defendant tries to turn the lectern into a stage, hour-long declarations of goodness, claims of being mentally framed, accusations that everyone else here is corrupt or confused. The judge lets enough of it through to satisfy the record and then cuts the performance where justice requires an ending. Life, twice. Without the possibility of parole. You feel the decision like a door closing in a building that finally feels structurally sound. Appeals will be filed, because that's how the system breathes, and appeals will fail, because evidence doesn't forget when theater fades. Justice is slow when it's careful, but careful is how you sleep at night. Life, twice. Without the possibility of parole. The sentence lands, but it doesn't reset the clock to 1987, and the families know it. Relief arrives with limits. It comes in the shape of a chair that finally stops wobbling, but still remembers every time it tipped. In hallways outside the courtroom, hugs feel like scaffolding. Rick's brother talks about the silence that replaced laughter at birthdays, and how even good news learned to carry a border of gray. Gail's sister says closure isn't an ending. It's a permission slip to grieve without arguing with the past, to speak about Gail and Rick without rehearsing the crime first. They don't get their people back. They get the right names on the right lines. It matters, but nothing about it is simple. At home, the practical world rearranges itself the way it does after long storms. Boxes that once lived on the floor because no one knew what to do with them get labeled and shelved. Photos come out of drawers and onto mantles, where they should have been all along. The file in the county's records room gets a last date stamp and slides into place, not because anyone forgot, but because, finally, forgetting is no longer part of the job. Appeals will try the locks, because the justice system insists on testing doors. One by one, the courts rattle the handles and step back. Conviction affirmed. The legal process that once felt endless finishes its circuit and sits down. In Holland and around Ottawa County, trust doesn't return to its naive version. It becomes the adult kind, the kind that locks doors and still lends a cup of sugar, that teaches kids how to notice and still lets them ride their bikes. Porch lights glow longer. Neighborhood watches keep their group texts short and useful. The community stops pretending it can't happen here and learns to say, we'll make it harder to happen here. Churches and schools fold safety checks into the same weekly rhythms that used to be reserved for potlucks and pep rallies. The lake keeps breathing, and people keep waving, but the wave means what it should mean now. I see you. We look out for each other. What the verdict can't do, and no verdict ever can, is build the life that was about to be built. The nursery doesn't arrive. The paint swatch with the circle color is still just a card in a drawer. The door Rick would have hung true will always be a fraction off unless someone else finishes it. And even then, every hinge will sound different. That's the nature of interrupted love. You can complete tasks, you cannot complete the life those tasks were supposed to hold. Yet the house on Ransom Street, the one they stripped down and taught to know their names, still stands. It becomes a kind of ordinary monument. Not marble, not bronze, just wood and memory, proof that a young couple had a plan and were good at carrying it out together. The house is the right symbol because it's the opposite of spectacle. It's work. It's care. It's a future made out of weekends, exactly what the killer couldn't stand and exactly what the verdict honors. For the detectives, done doesn't feel like victory. It feels like stewardship. They close the binder with an ending, but they know closures like this pay forward. Someone else will sit in a room like Pam's and decide to speak. Someone else will roll a window down to the wrong person and need a town to keep showing up for the long version of justice. That's why Cold Case Files matters, not because it conjures miracles out of microscopes, but because it teaches patience with teeth. Justice delayed is still justice when families refuse to forget and investigators refuse to let stories stay too neat. If you've watched this far, you already understand something most people learn the hard way. Justice is not an event. It's a practice. It's the practice of calling back when a worker doesn't show up. It's the practice of telling the truth even when the truth has an aftertaste. It's the practice of believing people who describe control that never bruised skin but rearranged a life. It's the practice of looking at a wiped scene and seeing the outline of what belongs there. It's a long, disciplined refusal to be bored by the ordinary facts that point to the right door. So, what do we carry out of this story besides names and dates? Carry the lesson that entitlement hates boundaries, and that no is not only an answer, it's a safety device. Carry the reminder that families are not immune to danger just because they share a roof or a last name. Carry the proof that secrets age, that scripts crack, that people who rehearse a lie eventually press so hard the lie splits. Carry the truth that a town can grow up without growing hard. And carry the invitation. If your town still whispers about a case, tell someone. Cases don't reopen themselves. People do. Maybe that means emailing a cold case unit with the memory you didn't think mattered. Maybe it means checking on the person who used to sit at your dinner table and seemed to shrink every time certain topics came up. Maybe it means learning the non-emergency number for your department and saving it to your phone. Maybe it means being the friend who drives someone to make a statement, then waits in the lobby with a cup of bad coffee and the kind of patience that helps courage keep its footing. You can also help in ways that take minutes and ripple for years. Share this story if it helped you see the outlines of control and the shape of persistence. Someone in your feed lives in a place like Holland and needs to hear that careful work works. Subscribe to keep these cases in circulation, and not just ours. Algorithms favor noise. We can teach them to favor signal. Hit like if you believe, as we do, that cold case files belong in the light. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and which case your community still can't stop talking about. We read those. We map them. Sometimes the tip that cracks a silence doesn't start with a badge. It starts with a neighbor. For Gail and Rick, we say their names because speaking them is a kind of caretaking we still get to do. For Pam, we acknowledge the cost of the sentence she carried so others could hear the truth. For the families, we accept that closure will always need an asterisk and honor the courage it took to keep showing up to rooms where the past was reassembled piece by piece. For the community, we recognize the arc, from unlocked doors to deadbolts to a new, steadier confidence that doesn't confuse vigilance with fear. When we end these episodes, we don't lay the past to rest. We lay the story down where it belongs. In a place where memory does its work without running the show. If you believe in that kind of ending, this is your channel. Subscribe, like, and share. So the next story has more eyes on it, more ears ready to hear the messy, human truth. Tell us your town, your case, your questions. Justice is slow when it's careful, but careful is how you sleep at night. And for the people who loved Gail and Rick, careful is how they finally can. Justice delayed is still justice. Keep the porch light on. For memory, for courage, for the next person who decides to speak.